Hey friends, good morning. Welcome to the Belong Collective. So glad you're with us. Happy Sunday morning. If you're new to the Belong Collective is an inclusive, Jesus-shaped community, and we're so thankful that you're here. You can find out more at thebelongcollective.org. Big news that we have coming up is that we have in-person gathering next week, next Sunday at Camp Hill. All the information's on our website under the calendar tab. We're meeting at the Giant Community Center. Going to be a great time. New venue for us. We've never been there before. We're kind of in this pop-up in different places stage. Mostly we've been at Hershey Lodge, but we're really looking forward to this venue, checking it out. I know for some of you it's a little bit of a distance. For others of you, it's right nearby. Oh my goodness. This is the second time I've filmed in Hershey and the train has gone by during filming the announcements. If you know, 6 months ago, I think I filmed one over by here and it did this. That's hilarious. Anyway, this Sunday is a unique Sunday. It's an interview with Meghan Tschanz. I got to interview her about her book, Women Rising. I interviewed her for my podcast, and I thought it would be great here. So a portion of that interview is going to be here. If you want to listen to the whole thing, you can check out my podcast. But a portion of it for this Sunday morning will be good for us. I think it'll be a good conversation about purity culture, about some women's issues, and just especially for any of those who grew up in conservative kind of evangelical Christianity. This could be a good kind of introduction to some of the purity culture within that might, need to be rethought. And her book, Women Rising, is one that I would highly recommend. And so here it is, my interview with Meghan Tschanz. I'm here with Meghan Tschanz, and we're going to talk about her book, Women Rising. Meghan, tell them a little bit about the book, yourself, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so much to tell, right? Like I could write a book because I did, because there's really so much to tell. But a brief history. I grew up in the conservative evangelical church. I was raised to believe that women were less than. And while that wasn't the language that was used, it was implied in basically everything. So women couldn't lead, women had to have the covering of men, women were there essentially to bring their husbands pleasure, to serve them in the home, to take care of children. And so these were all of the teachings I grew up with. And I remember like really young thinking, I don't think this doesn't feel right to me. But of course, not being exposed to any other teachings, I, bought in, or I tried to buy in, I should say, and was constantly told that I wasn't doing girlhood or womanhood right, but I was too opinionated, I was too loud, I was too competitive, I was always too much, right? Everyone kept telling me to shrink. And in addition to this, I was raised with purity culture and really harmful beliefs about women and their bodies, and how I was taught basically my body caused men to do bad things. And so in my book, I talk about how I've been sexually assaulted actually several times, sadly, but a lot of the time I would internalize that as my fault because that's what I had been taught. Due to purity culture. And so my story is a story of trying so hard to be the woman, the girl that the church wanted me to be, but then coming to realize that all of these teachings that I had been taught are actually really harmful, and in a way that's not just like personally harmful, but harmful on a large scale. And so I eventually did missions work with sexually exploited women, with marginalized women. And I saw a pattern again and again of women being sexually abused, assaulted, belittled, not believed. I saw it again and again and again. And At first, because I had been taught such an individualism in the conservative church that I didn't make the connection to a larger system. I didn't see patriarchy at play. And it wasn't until towards the end of my work with exploited women that I had an encounter where I realized, wait a second, this is patriarchy. This is not what Christ wants. And it's actually harming women, and leading to sexual assault, sexual trafficking. Like, all of this stuff is a result of patriarchy. And people listening were like, whoa, how did you get there? I will get there. I will explain how I got there. But that was my big realization. And so I actually quit my job as a missionary and wrote a book and started a podcast. And so that's where I am now.
Yeah, I think you're, like, even in your, like, knowing, like, how did you get there? How did you connect all that? Like, and I think one thing I'm noticing over many issues is that people are done kind of putting a Band-Aid on it, or trying to make it more flowery, or clean up the language, but are more interested in, like, what's the system supporting this injustice?
Yes.
Like, what is at the root, so we can just stop growing this? Like, we need to stop growing this, not trying to, like, hey, let's cut back a little bit here and let's cut back a little bit here, but let it keep growing. We're like, no, we're going to uproot that. Something new needs to be planted there. And I appreciate your work in this, because I just finished the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast. I don't know if you've been listening to that, but that has, so many echoes of, like, things I've dealt with in my time in ministry, but also the podcast parts about women were incredibly, there's nothing else to call it other than abuse. Like, that's what it was. And then on top of that, I'm a Liberty University grad. Don't judge me for that. But coming out of that, and then hearing some of the stories of abuse there and covering it up, and some of the, like, very patriarchal ways of belittling women or not believing women, and seeing how that's not just a cultural thing alone. It's not divorced from theology, is what I guess I'm trying to say. Like, there's a theological belief that, like, I cannot believe you because I'm in authority over you, almost. Like, and just how harmful that is in so much of interaction. So I appreciate your work, and you'll get all kinds of opportunity here to explain that. But let's start here. If someone doesn't know, you mentioned a word or a phrase, purity culture. If someone is outside of Christianity and has never heard what purity culture is, can you give a definition to purity culture, or come close to update people on that?
Yeah, I don't know if the definition I'll use is, like, I don't know if it's, like, in the dictionary, but I can tell you what it is, essentially.
Those of us who grew up in it know what it is.
Yes,
I'm trying to think about those on the outside. Yeah.
Okay, so if you're not familiar, in the evangelical Christian church, there was a whole movement, which they called, like, a purity movement, which was trying to prevent, if we're giving them the benefit of the doubt, let's say we're giving them the benefit of the doubt, trying to prevent premarital sex. I think that's what their intention was. And I think even if we go farther, maybe their intention was that women wouldn't be objectified. So, if they were so covered up, maybe women wouldn't be objectified and men wouldn't be tempted by them. But basically, purity culture was the set of teachings that tried to dissuade even children from having sex. And these teachings started young for me. I think they started when I was like 11 or 12. That what I was taught as a woman was that men or boys were very sexually voracious creatures, that they couldn't control themselves if they saw something that they found arousing. And so my job as a young girl, because remember, these teachings started pre-pubescent, before I reached puberty, that I was responsible for covering up my body, and so that a man or a boy would not feel sexually aroused by me. And so there was so much teaching on me saving myself, keeping myself pure, it was my responsibility to stop any kind of sexual thing happening to me. And so, I mean, I took that to heart. Like, I did cover up, I did follow the rules. It's like when you go to the pool, the boys could wear whatever they wanted, and girls would be wearing t-shirts and shorts. And this teaching was taught again and again: your body is dangerous, your body is harmful, you are a source of lust, or the term that was commonly used was a stumbling block. Oftentimes young girls' bodies were likened to objects or food. So what I was taught is that I was a flower, and that each time something sexual happened to me, or I did something sexual, I'd lose a petal. And if I lost all of my petals, if I had 5, I don't know how many, they never told me how many petals I had, but I would be worthwhile to no one. And so the teaching was, no one wants a ball to flower. It's gross. Don't do anything sexual. Your whole worth is in your purity. Other teachings went that girls were a sucker, a lollipop, and no one wants a lollipop that has been licked. No one wants an Oreo that had been licked. No one wants a spit-in cup. There were so many analogies that young girls were taught that they are objects to be consumed by men. And once they are consumed once, or once they've been touched, they are no longer worthwhile. They no longer have value, and they're no longer worth protection. And so I was raised with this, and it was super harmful, super damaging. But I remember being chastised for, when I was 13, for wearing a shirt that when I raised my hand, like the smallest sliver of my stomach showed, and my youth pastor like shamed me, told me that men would do bad things, that I needed to change immediately because I was bringing shame upon myself. And so I did change. I wore nothing but baggy shirts. And later that week, I had a stranger on the street. When I was out with my youth group, I had lagged behind to pet a stray dog, and this stranger came up and grabbed my breast when I was 13 years old. And I thought it was my fault.
I remember reading that in here, and I was like, oh.
Yeah.
And that's so hard. That's so hard because you've been taught that it's your fault. You don't have any, like, there's no like, all the injustice of that act falls on your shoulders for doing something wrong, instead of you being violated, that someone violated your space and your, autonomy. Like that, instead of that reality of like you being empowered, like to be like, that was wrong. Like that was wrong. I'm not, instead you're almost gaslit into this. It was something I did. Like,
I deserve it.
Yeah, exactly.
I wasn't covered up. And that's exactly what I thought. I didn't tell anyone. I was obviously completely terrified and traumatized by what happened. And so I like ran up with a group. No one had even noticed that it had happened. And that night I had nightmares. I like woke up crying like the next morning, and like no one, like, and I couldn't tell anyone what it was really about, because I thought if I told someone what happened, it would show that I wasn't valuable anymore, that what happened to me was justified because I had not covered up, or my being was too sexy or tempting. And I will say that this thinking is so dominant that it even followed me into my 20s. I had another experience where I was actually on the mission field, and there was a man who, I was trapped, and a man masturbated to me, which is a terrible thing to happen. But I was teaching two young kids tennis lessons, and this man approached and started masturbating outside the fence. I tried to fight him off with my tennis racket. He didn't care. And I didn't have a phone, and I didn't know where I was, and I didn't have any way to get out of the situation. And so I just remember hiding behind a wall with these two kids, trying to protect them. And I remember like just being traumatized. Eventually someone did come to my rescue and chase the man away. But I remember feeling like this was my fault. I was showing too much skin, even though I was covered from head, like I was wearing a t-shirt and pants. I thought it must have been my fault. And feeling dirty, feeling like I wanted to take my body off and discard it, feeling like I would never be clean again. And I remember like they because I was on the mission field, they contacted like my coach, the guy that, this married couple that was supposed to help us. And I remember him calling me and praying over me. And he said, whatever is wrong with Meghan, that men keep doing this to her, I pray that she's clean again. I pray that it comes off her. And this is like, at this point, I was 23 years old. And even then, I think he was really genuinely trying to help me. But even in his prayer, I was the problem. It was my problem because this thing happened to me, and it's happened to me before, and it happened to me previously. So there must be something wrong with her that this keeps happening. But here's the truth. 1 in 3 women this happens to, probably more. And we've been trained not to talk about it because we're not believed. Yeah. And people tell us, well, why did it take you 10 years to speak up? Well, because I was told it was my fault. And we see how people treat people who speak up. And so I just, for me, it's super damaging. It's pervasive throughout society. I remember giving a talk in a church about sexual assault. I told some of the stories I just told. And I said, okay, so what is the problem here? And this woman kept on answering, you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. You shouldn't have been there. You should have done something different. And then finally she realized that she was victim blaming me and started sobbing in front of this whole room and said, what have I been teaching my daughter? And this is the problem. This is the problem of patriarchy. We're putting the sin of sexual assault on women's shoulders when we have no control over that happening to us. It had nothing to do with what I was wearing, what I was doing. This was solely on the men who decided to cross boundaries, to not respect my autonomy or my consent. This was not on me, this was on them. But our society, and specifically the church, has a whole teaching on how this is women's fault.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you bring up society and you bring up, in that even analogy, someone who had a daughter, or that story, someone who had a daughter. I have a daughter, she's 12, and I see this very clearly. So I was a youth pastor. So, I mean, not only have I seen this, in some ways I've participated in it. I think I caught in my mid 20s, like, ooh, I don't know how I feel about this, just from like, even just psychological development, how this is like shame. This is like, I'm just very anti using shame as a motivator for behavior in any, even if the behavior ends up like, I sometimes wonder if we use shame, if, the end results really do justify the means, because I think that shame leaves something that eventually needs to be uprooted, like, and whatever lesson was learned from it is probably going to be uprooted with it. And so just seeing how much of the purity culture, the true love waits culture, where we sign the cards at all the Christian festivals. Every Christian festival I went to growing up had an opportunity to sign a card. I signed a card multiple times every summer when we went to those festivals. I remember every winter when we would go to different retreats and things like that, there would be, that kind of call out to all the students. So it seems like I grew up in a very similar culture, obviously from this perspective of a man, like that was a different experience. And I wasn't necessarily aware of how my female friends were experiencing that, you know what I mean? And I was homeschooled too. So I was even more, I think, in some ways sheltered from how society was also working in this, because now my daughter's 12, she goes to public school, and she's been dress coded many times and will probably continue to be dress coded, because I'm not partnering with the school. Like, this is something where I'm like, I think it's funny that my boys can wear basketball jerseys to school and there's not a problem here, but my daughter can wear something that's the same exact, amount. And now we have a problem. And like, it's a shoulder, like this isn't even cleavage. Like, and and I'm just like, I don't and the thing I just keep getting back is, well, it's a distraction. And I'm like, no, it's not. Like, it's just not. Like, and if you want to say that, you've lost all high ground for me in any like legitimate conversation. So anyway, that's like, my daughter's very much like, she's an 8 on the Enneagram. I mean, she doesn't know that, but I know that because I'm an 8 on the Enneagram. And so do you do the Enneagram?
Yeah, I'm a 7-wing 8.
Oh, okay. So you've got a little bit of that 8 in you. There you go.
I have a very strong 8 wing. I will tell you what's up.
That's good.
So,
yeah. So anyway, she is, not afraid to call out the inconsistencies in that. And she's just very different than, like, her generation just is so different than my generation when it comes to seeing this differently, which I'm so excited that I haven't handed her any of that purity culture. I'm sure I have some in the sense of just like not knowing what I've handed her, but I haven't done it in any systematic way. And I guess my question to you, as someone who's very much aware of the toxicity within purity culture and within the shame that it certainly brings about in women, what would your advice be to someone who has a 12-year-old daughter, does not want to hand them purity culture, but also wants them to be wise in how they are sexually, because I still do think there's value in, I don't know that I would say it's value in not having premarital sex. I think it's value in that when sex comes without commitment, there's a lot of danger in that place, and not danger in a sense of like, if that happens to you, you should feel broken or something, but more danger in that it can lead to brokenness when sex happens outside of commitment. And maybe you have a different perspective on that than me, but I guess as I'm trying to steward my 3 kids, I'm thinking through like, man, it's going to be interesting teaching my 2 younger boys this, but my daughter who's 12 and kind of leading the way, I want to empower her. I want her to feel like she's in control. And I want her to also feel like, it's okay to make mistakes here and still not be like shamed about it, but also a feeling like a mistake here it can be a big deal. It can be a traumatic experience. And so I think you said something earlier when you brought up purity culture. You said like, maybe these were people with good intentions. And I know a lot of people who bought into hook, line and sinker to purity culture that I do believe were well-intentioned people who didn't realize what the outcomes would be. I don't want to be the same person, well-intentioned, and then I haven't thought through the outcome. So in your knowledge, like, what would you be telling youth pastors or parents to be teaching kids these days?
Well, I think the first thing that we need to teach about, we need to think about what's the problem here. Okay. Why is my body even considered distracting? What about society is teaching women that their bodies are sexual objects? What is it about society that is teaching little boys to view little girls' bodies as sexual objects? And so I want to zoom out here and like, what is actually the problem? Well, the problem is that women are being objectified and viewed as sexual objects, whether or not they're doing anything sexual at all. And so I want to view patriarchy. I want to talk about patriarchy, and I want to share what actually causes sexual assault. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, and I think this is a huge, massive failing of purity culture. Purity culture teaches that, sexual assault is about lust. That is not at all what causes sexual assault. Sexual assault, plain and simple, is caused by power differentials. There are so many studies that come out about this. There's a psychoanalyst, her name is Lynn Yonah, she studies this specifically. And she says that while sexual assault might be sexual in nature, it's ultimately about power and control. And so she gives all of these examples. When we hear stories of sexual abuse, sexual assault, we often see it in a way of someone in power doing it to someone who doesn't have power. And so we'll see adult do it to a child. We'll see a youth pastor do it to a child. We'll see a pastor do it to a child. We'll see a pastor do it to a woman or a secretary. We will see a professor do it to a student. And so over and over again, we see these power differentials. And I think we need to even back up even further and see the power differentials that are present between men and women. And so sexual assault is this idea that men feel entitled to a woman's body without her consent. It's about power. It's about domination. It's about control. And so I think if we understand that, the problem isn't sexual feelings, it's not being sexually aroused. Those are completely normal things for anyone going through puberty, right? That's completely normal. And I think it's really important that we don't shame those. What we need to understand and what we need to be teaching is the power differentials that are present in society. What messages, and this is even outside of the church, what messages are we giving about women's sexuality? Does a woman only rise to the top through objectifying? And I don't even want to say objectifying herself, but it's what we've been taught, right? right? Cosmo magazine, all about women, how they can be skinny enough, how they can be sexy enough, how they can get a man. You know, I talk about in my book how when I was growing up, all of my societal teaching about being woman was how to please a man sexually, how to be attractive to him, how to be skinny, how to do my makeup right, how to be hairless, all of these things, how to make myself sexually attractive to men. What I grew up with in the church was not how to be sexually attractive to men, but how not to be sexually attractive to men, but how to be submissive to men, how to meet their needs. So they don't have to deal with their internal, feelings of sexual nature or whatever. I was supposed to erase myself so they didn't have to struggle with it. I was supposed to make their life easier. Yeah. I was there to serve them. And so they're two different messages, but they both boil down to the same thing, that women are there for men. And that's present in society because we live in a patriarchal society. And it's also present within the church, but it looks different. And so I want to back up there. And that's what I want to first talk about. Women, my daughter, are not there for the viewing of men, for the pleasure of men. And when you are dating or interested, you need to make sure that that man sees you as a person, doesn't try to control you, doesn't ask you to be submissive, to really look out for these red flags that indicate that he thinks he's better than you, or that you have to listen to him, because ultimately that's what's causing sexual assault. And if you look at the studies, it's all there. This is about power differentials. And so I think the reason that we see this so much in the church, why we see it so much with purity culture, is because what the church was teaching was power differentials. Men be in charge, women be submissive. That is inherently setting up power differentials between men and women. That is what causes any kind of abuse, but specifically sexual abuse as well. And I just want to point out, a lot of people, what I was taught is purity culture is like, sex is great as long as it's within marriage. And I would like to really dismantle that, because I think there's a lot of unhealthy sex that happens within marriage. All of these marriage books, right? Like you have Love and Respect and all of these, like Every Man's Battle. And I haven't read most of them, but there's a woman named Sheila Gregoire. I don't know if you know who she is, but she talks a lot about this, where she dismantles these ideas that are taught in Christian books about sex. And I think there's so much sexual abuse happening within sexual Christian marriages, because we're taught that women, deny your needs. If you don't want to have sex, that's fine. There's no such thing as marital rape. And they're having these sexual experiences where it's all about the man and his pleasure and has nothing to do with her. And that is literally making her an object to be used by him. And so if I want to talk to my kids about it, I don't have kids yet, but when I do, what I'm going to talk to them about is I'm going to talk to them about power and control and consent and coming to have my daughter realize that she's not there for the sexual pleasure of men. I want my sons to understand, if he is feeling sexually aroused, that he's not entitled to get something for that. That's something, I mean, women have sexual urges too, but that's something we have to deal with on our own. It's not like we're going to go up and grab someone's junk because we're aroused, but that's what happens to women. And that's because of society teaches that men are more powerful and have more responsibility and are more entitled to women's bodies than vice versa. And so I think that's why when we see violence happening, it is almost always from men. And I think that's because they've been taught that they're entitled to things and that they can, get it by force. And then on top of that, if you think about what patriarchy is teaching men, so it's not just harmful to women, but to men, you're telling men they can't have their full range of emotions, that any kind of physical touch that's not sexual in nature is not valid. So I think a lot of these boys are growing up starved from touch. Like, girls are allowed to hold hands, cuddle, whatever, but from the ages of like 5 or 6, boys are not allowed to have that need met, that need for physical touch. And then they're only allowed to touch in a way that's sexual. And so when they like a girl, they think the only acceptable way to interact with her is on a sexual level. And I can actually think of interactions where I felt completely devalued in a situation with a male friend. But now upon further reflection, I'm like, I don't think he knew how to interact with me in a way that wasn't sexualized, because this is what he was taught. And so I think patriarchy really harms men too. If you're taught that the only acceptable anger or emotion to express is anger, then yeah, that's why we're going to see more violence from men. If they're taught that they always have to be in control and dominating, then that makes sense why they would control and dominate others. And so that's why I think we really need to zoom out and see the messages that patriarchy is giving both men and women, because it's not helpful to anyone.
That's so good. Like that just needs to be a clip right there that people listen to. Like, I think the one word you said that I've been thinking about a lot lately is consent. And I think it's interesting because I can honestly say in all my time as a student, and even as an adult, I don't ever remember a pastor telling me consent. Like, you need, before you enter into a relationship with someone, before you even kiss someone, before you hold their hand, ask for consent. Like, it was never talked about. Like, and I look back now and I'm like, I'm shocked that was never talked about. That would just seem like square one. Like, now it might be that, hey, don't do that, but if you're going to do that, get consent. But it was always like, no, we're not going to give like, for example, it was the don't have sex, so we're not going to give out condoms. But it's like, even if you're going to say don't have sex, wouldn't it be good to have something, like, in the event that you chose to do that? Or like it I don't know. It just seems to me like an interesting reality that the church has never really taught consent yet. One of the fruits of the spirit is self-control, and having enough self-control to pause and be like, hey, I need to get this person's consent if we're going to have a physical relationship, even beyond sex. But I need to, get consent first. So, I mean, have you seen churches teaching consent? Do you remember in your youth any consent, like any talks about consent that maybe were there and I just missed it? I don't want my perspective of purity culture to be the only one, but I sense that wasn't really something that was emphasized. Or
no, consent wasn't taught at all.
Yeah.
Consent wasn't taught at all. And I will say, to take it to another degree, the way that purity culture was taught is like women were your prize, right? If you did it right, then you got the reward of a pure virgin or whatever. Yeah. And so I even remember, you talked about like signing purity pledges. What I did in my youth group is I wrote this letter when I was like 12, but it was a letter too.
Yeah. To my future wife. Yeah.
Yes. To my future husband. And about how I was saving myself. But even the language that they told me, I read it as an adult. I actually gave it to I did like quote unquote follow the rules. I was a virgin when I got married. Yeah. But again, I think the way I arrived there, like you said, like, I'm actually glad that at this point in my life that I only have healthy sexual experiences with my husband because he's an incredible man and values consent. And I'm really grateful for that. But the way that I arrived there is really messed up. But the letter that I wrote, literally what they told it, like they had the script for us to write. And it was like, I am a gift that has not been touched or unwrapped. So you get to unwrap this gift. And here you are. And this was literally the language, is like, I am an unopened gift for you. And here you go on our wedding night. And I read that letter as an adult and I was heartbroken that's what I was taught about it. And I gave it to my husband kind of as a joke when we got married. And he's like, this is depressing. And it's really sad. And so no, consent wasn't taught at all. Instead, what was taught was, I'm the prize if you keep it in your pants, essentially. Or even if you don't keep it in your pants, like that's kind of just like, women are there for you and your sexual pleasure. And that's literally what is taught in so many marriage books, is like, how do you fix a man's addiction to pornography? You are sexually available to him at all times. Like, again, it's her fault, not him. It's always you to be sexually available. And something that we're taught all the time, women are taught, is like, you need to be sexually available or he's going to cheat on you, because men are so out of control that they're going to get this need met, whether or not, you have it. And so it's just, there's so much there to unpack, but these ideas are really, really harmful. And I will say that I encountered sexual assault from men and my peers in this way, in the church, that touched my body without my consent. So.
Yeah. I mean, I think starting at consent is a great spot, but we have so much more that we need to add to that conversation. Like you said, the power dynamics of everything, I think, in our world right now are being discussed, obviously racially, all over the place. We're talking about the reality of power dynamics in systems of injustice or inequity. And so, when I think of like talking to my daughter about this, I obviously think consent's important. The power differential is important. What's your view of dating? Like, I mean, maybe these are things you haven't really thought about, but like you and I grew up in a world where like we kiss dating goodbye. You know what I mean?
Right.
You don't date anybody. Like you only get involved with somebody if the goal is to marry them. And and I mean, I married my high school sweetheart. So like in a lot of ways, I would say, and me and my wife have a great relationship. I would say the first few years of our relationship, and hopefully she doesn't mind me saying this, publicly, sexually were difficult because we had both kind of grown up in this, like, don't do it. And then the moment like we could do it, it was like, this is weird. And there's so much shame built into this. Like we could not mentally and emotionally disengage from the shame connected to it. That it just, for a while, it didn't work. And I've literally seen friends who grew up in purity culture get married and get divorced within a year or two. And when I talk to them, it's, 90% of that is sexual. Like it's sexual compatibility, and that incompatibility from growing up in such, I guess what I'm saying is it's not like a light switch. You can't just turn it on. You can't just have all the shame and then it's gone the next day, the moment you put a ring on it. Like it's not, there is a long-term effect to this.
Right.
So I guess what I'm kind of talking or getting at is like, what does a path look like? And obviously I think in our world, what we're realizing is there's not one path, there's a lot of paths. But as we think about a Jesus-centered approach, because obviously like I still want my life to be shaped by Jesus. And that involves all of my life, including my sexual life. Right. How should I be guiding my children? And obviously in my own sexual life, I still have a sexual life, but just because I'm married doesn't mean I don't have, I don't want the fruits of the spirit to shape my sexual life with my wife, but I'm more saying like certainly people who are coming into their sexuality, who are figuring out that. And I think, and I also want to be clear, we haven't talked at all about this yet, but even the way in which you and I were handed, write a letter to your future husband. Like I've already started using language with my children of your future partner. Whenever I talk about that with them, like, I don't want to assume you're going to the heteronormativeness of it all. I don't want to assume. Right. So even that is another area where I feel like obviously you and I that was never considered, you know what I mean? So, but I guess, share a little bit about that. Like, what do you see some healthy paths being in dating or in courting or in marriage, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like a harder question to answer because I'm not at that point.
Yeah.
Don't have kids.
This is a selfish question. This is not. This is for no one else. It's only for me. No.
I mean, I think there's a lot there, and I think again, it's so much about learning to have healthy communication, understanding power, understanding all of that. And there's something you said at the beginning that, oh yes. So you're talking about like the switch.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important to acknowledge because I also, when I started having sex, struggled with that, a lot of shame-based stuff. And I actually want to say, just for your audience, that this actually shows up in women's bodies. It's women who grew up in purity cultures, body responds the same way that a lot of women who have been sexually assaulted or raped shows up. And so a lot of women, a lot of women who grew up in purity culture have vaginismus, where their body will actually physically shut down the act of sex. And they're seeing, this is actually something studied. So I had a pelvic health physical therapist on the line. And so she specifically works with like women and who have what's called hypertonic pelvic floors, which can lead to a lot of painful sex, problems with sex, but their body will physically shut down the act. And they've only seen that with survivors of sexual violence, or purity culture. And they're actually seeing this about the same rate of girls or women who have grown up in purity culture, also having this physical response, even PTSD from purity culture. And there's another researcher so people who are listening, if they want to look it up, look up Amy Moses, who's a pelvic health physical therapist. And they're both on my podcast. If you want to search for it, they talk about this. And then the other person is Dr. Laura Anderson. She just got her PhD. She has, she's a therapist that talks about religious trauma, but her specialty was actually about sexual assault. And she talks in depth about how purity culture in a lot of ways, I mean, it is abuse and it shows up as sexual abuse in a lot of women's bodies, and not everyone, but a lot of women will have responses that are similar to PTSD. Their bodies will shut down the act of sex. And so I know plenty of women who actually have vaginismus due to purity culture and that are trying to unlearn that, trying to be okay with their sexuality and their bodies. But I just wanted to share that because I think it's
wild.
Really
I didn't even know that was a thing like that. See, these are the things that what name, give the name of your podcast, Faith and Feminism, right?
Yeah. Faith and Feminism. If they want to look it up, search for Amy Moses. She's a pelvic floor physical therapist. And I think everyone should listen, whether you're a man or a woman, should listen to that podcast. I think it's really important that we talk about it, because I think the female body has been so stigmatized and we do need to talk about it. And it's causing a lot of problems. And then the other one, her name is Dr. Laura Anderson, where I just mentioned where I talked about purity culture. That episode is actually coming out next Tuesday. So it's December.
So it'll
14th.
probably be out by the time this comes out.
Yeah.
So that's awesome.
Yes. So she talks about recovering from sexual assault, and she does specifically talk about how purity culture actually shows up in the body as if the same way it does with survivors of sexual violence. So I just wanted to point that out because I think that's really important.
No, that's good. I mean, we don't have to talk you don't have to give me any more advice. I'll call you on my own when I have questions about my daughter. No, I'm just kidding.
Okay.
So we've talked a lot about purity culture and power dynamics and consent. What do you see in the future of the church? I feel like we're in the middle of this mass exodus right now, which I, in a lot of ways, even as a pastor, fully support. I think the church has been on the wrong side of racial justice. I think the church has been on the wrong side of affirmation toward the LGBT community. I think the church has clearly been on the wrong side of women and women's issues and having any knowledge or desire or awareness of women's issues. And I think we're starting to feel the repercussions of all of that. And I think, honestly, COVID has kind of in some ways accelerated that, because it got people distant enough from the church for a period of time that gave them this reality that, like, oh, God didn't strike me down. Like, I don't know. This reality that, like, I don't need this, in a sense of like, I think so many people also, part of that, like, not purity culture, but part of that same culture also has this like guilt and shame with attendance, involvement, commitment. And I think people are starting to shed that guilt of like, I'm not involved enough, or I'm not there enough, or if I stopped going, I would be on the outs with God or something. Like, as we enter into this new, whatever the church is going to be, what are you seeing? And it could be related to your book. It could not be. I'm just curious. I like asking people who are at the intersection of like thinking differently beyond the boundaries, and also like what they're seeing from their perspective, the church becoming in the next few years.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really great question. And I think something I do want to clarify is, like, when we talk about the church, I think you and I are talking about the evangelical church. And so for me, you know what, I left evangelicalism in 2016 when they elected Donald Trump. I mean, I don't think I would have said that out loud because I think it was hard to admit that. It was everything, but I wasn't deconstructing Christ. I was deconstructing the powers and principalities that we saw in play at the church: homophobia, racism, patriarchy, all of these things, all of these isms that I think don't reflect Christ. And so what I want to bring us to there's a couple of directions that my head is going in. But I want to say what kind of saved me from giving up. I would never give up on Christ because I love Jesus. I love what he did. I love the way he stood up to abusive systems, to the powers that be, that he brought those in from the margin, that he included women in ministry, that he liberated them in so many subtle ways, which I could talk about forever. So I loved Jesus. I was really done with the institution of the church, at least the way it had been presented to me. And it was actually through reading womanist theology. So womanist is Black woman, like Black feminist theology. And the way they talk about the Bible was in such an authentic way that called out these power differentials that I realized that while my my tract, whatever, of Christianity was really gross with patriarchy and white supremacy and Christian nationalism, there were pure strands of the faith that had survived. And so if we look at the Black church, so there's always been two churches, right? I had someone on my podcast talk to me about it. Her name is Rose J. Percy, if you want to listen to it, but she talks about the People's Church and the Ruler's Church. For as long as there's been time, there has been people using religion to dominate and control others. We see this in scripture with the Pharisees. What are they except the religious elite that try to use their rules and their opinions to completely miss the point of faith, like right, to love your neighbor as yourself. They completely miss that and make it about all of these rules about, you can't do anything on the Sabbath, you can't do this, you can't do that, whatever. And so we see from actually the Bible, people using religion as a way to control people, as a way to make them afraid. And I think this is what we would call the ruler's church. So they're using it as a way to control power, to control populace, to stay in power. And so we see that this is a way for me to be superior to you. See that in the Bible. We see this continuing across history. We know that missions, in the medieval times, was people going and killing anyone that wasn't a Christian and claiming that land for Christ. We know that. Yet we know these stories. We know that in the United States, Christianity was used to uphold slavery, that it was used to uphold white supremacy. This has always been true. Religion, faith, Christianity, any type of religion. We can talk about Islam or Hinduism. We can see people using it to control people, to maintain power. But I think there's a true church, which Rose J. Percy called the People's Church. And I think this is actually from James Cone, but don't quote me on that. You'll have to listen to the podcast.
Okay.
Because I don't remember exactly, because she was like kind of reteaching me something, but there's the People's Church. And at the same time, we've had this dominant using Christianity or whatever for power, to maintain power, to harm people. We also have seen Christianity, like what I would call a true Christianity, of those bringing those from the margin in. And so while we see slaveholders using Christianity, we also saw the most prominent abolitionists led by Christianity to fight it. While we see Martin Luther King and so many other civil rights activists using Christianity, understanding the core tenets of Christianity to call for justice, we see the people at, different schools, right, who didn't want to lose their status or whatever, using Christianity to maintain segregation, to maintain racism. And so I think there's two different churches that have always existed. We have the People's Church and the Ruler's Church. And I want to be part of the People's Church. And the only way I can be part of the People's Church is to to learn my complicity in the ruler's church. What have I done? What have I been a part of? I've been a part of patriarchy. I've been a part of homophobia. I've been a part of white supremacy. I'm complicit in those systems because that's what I was raised in. And then I grew up and I encountered different things that led me to question it. And I realized, oh my goodness, I'm being complicit. I actually don't think Jesus is for these harmful systems. And, the Bible talks about powers and principalities. Our battle is not against flesh and blood, but powers and principalities. I think powers and principalities are not demons or whatever we've been told. I actually think they're powers and principalities. I think they're systems of oppression that have been harming people for a long time. And I will not be complicit in those systems anymore. And so I'm going to learn to repent. I'm going to learn through loving kindness to do better. And so for me, being part of the people's church, I think the true church of Christ is realizing my complicity, continually asking and evaluating myself. In what ways am I trying to be superior to others and use that superiority for my own benefit? Because God tells us to come as a servant, to give up our power, to give up our rights. And so I ask myself that question all the time. Am I acting superior? Because you know what? People in the deconstruction community can do this too. I'm better than you because I've deconstructed and you haven't, and so now I'm better than you. And so I'm constantly evaluating that idea that I'm better, that I'm superior because of whatever, and asking myself, am I being complicit in harmful systems? How can I do better? And I think that's the process of sanctification. I think that's the process of discipleship. And for me, the primary teachers I'm learning from Christianity today are those on the margin. So it's Black women mainly that I am gobbling up, reading their materials, women minorities that I'm learning so much from right now. And so all of that to say, I'm not sad. I am not sad about people leaving the ruler's church. I'm not sad about people leaving a system that put Donald Trump in power. I'm not sad about them leaving a system that says masks are bad. I'm not mad about them leaving a system that doesn't give a care for their neighbor or what they're suffering through. I'm happy about that because I think they're actually leaving the oppressive ruler's church. And I think maybe they're going to wander in the desert for a while. I felt like I did. And then I think a lot of us, I think, are going to find the people's church. And I think it's going to look different. But the church has constantly gone through reform. This is not anything new. And I think we'll find ourselves through listening and learning from those on the margins and centering their voices. And so I'll mention a few right now that I love. Dr. Will Gaffney wrote an incredible book called Womanist Midrash. A lot of civil rights leaders, Martin Luther King has great writings. James Cone has some good writings. And then you can also, some other people that I know personally, Kat Armas, she's a Latina writer. She wrote, oh gosh, I forgot the title of it. She wrote a book that I read and I can't remember the title of it. But I think there's people who are leading from the margins. And those are the people that I think, can come back through the authentic Christian faith too.
I think it's I really love that the power church or the people's church and the power church. Is that what it was? The power church, or is it the term
that's used as ruler's church.
The
ruler's church versus people.
But the ruler's church being about power and the people's church being about people would be my guess, right? I think that picture of the ruler's church is so unique because it's funny that you say it, because I've been, so you don't know my journey, or unless you did any research, but I don't expect that you did. But in 2019, I lost my license in the denomination I was in because I became LGBT affirming. And the church I was in was LGBT affirming. Like, we were 99, we did a vote and 99.6% was LGBT affirming. So, in that process, we, because of the denomination owning everything, they got everything. And then we just went and started a new community. And we are kind of birthing something new out of the ashes of that. And it's conflicting because so much of how I've been taught to plant a church is the ruler's church. And, I feel like so much of who I am as a pastor is that people's church thing, right? But like so much of what educated me, and this is how you do it. This is the business side of it. This is you got to get a building. You got it. But like last year, we gave away 67% of our budget. I've never been in a church that's given away that much of their budget to other nonprofits in the area that are doing work, homeless work, stuff like that. We're trying to do it differently. We don't have a building, but like, then there's this feeling of like, we need to get a building, or we need to do this, or we need to do that, because that's what churches do, you know? And I think it's going to take some time for even the people who have caught a vision for what the new like people's church looks like to like get more comfortable shedding so much of what the ruler's church handed us as dogmatic. Even if they didn't necessarily say it was dogmatic, it was so much a part of who we were, I think, as being attached to that. I don't know. This isn't really a question. It's just more me saying like, I love that analogy though, because it gives me like an either or statement. Is this a ruler's church decision or a people's church decision, or just that like that dichotomy? And then you said that Reformation has always been happening. And what's very unique is like almost every about 500 years, the church has what I guess you could call a major Reformation. And it seems like, I think we're in the midst of that. I mean, now obviously I have a very American landscape of the church, so I don't want to impose that on the world. And so like, I feel like here in Western culture, Christianity, predominantly white evangelicalism, we're going through some type of reckoning that is going to lead into a reform for at least us. I don't want to speak that over Africa or Asia or Latin America. I'm just more saying for us, we're clearly going through something. And previously, you know, you'd mentioned like the Reformation during Martin Luther, for example, like that was about 500 years ago. You know what I mean? Like that's very interesting how we have these like waves of reforms that when you study church history kind of build up, and then, you know, something happens. And I feel like the church needs to be made new again. I mean, it needs to be made new regularly, but there's something definitely big that needs to shift, or I don't know why my kids would have any reason to go to church, at least the way I grew up going to church. And if they didn't go to church the way I grew up going to church, I wouldn't want them to go to church the way I grew up going to church. And that's not like a slight at my parents or the things I learned. I don't feel like I have to burn everything down in my past in order to move forward. I want to honor that there was a lot of good things I learned in church. But I guess what I'm saying is like, as I recognize the systems and how much of that I've had to unlearn, I feel like the principles that were good about that I would love to learn, my kids to learn, can be learned in a way where the oppressive systems that I had to be handed in order to learn that aren't there anymore. Like, or aren't just the cost of doing business kind of, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know if that makes sense. So that dichotomy is really good. That ruler and people, sorry, that I have never thought of it that way. So I'm just sitting here processing it verbally on a podcast with you, and thankful for everyone listening. I don't know if you have anything to add to that. I was just more that's an interesting.
Yeah. I mean, there's a quote by Maya Angelou that says, once you know better, you do better. And I think that's basically, we're learning to know better and do better. I would encourage people who are intrigued by this idea of ruler's church versus people's church to listen to the podcast, because I did not do it justice. But she actually talks about, this was really crazy, but she broke down traits of the people's church versus the ruler's church down to worship style. It was very fascinating. And I will not, I will not try and repeat it because I don't remember.
That's a good teaser, because I'm going to go listen to that. I want to hear about that, because I'm sure there's things I've seen that I'm like, that doesn't sit right with me. And there's probably some traits there. That's good. So
the way you're processing with me is actually how I was processing with her. So I get it. Yeah. Cause you're like trying to be like, hold on, that makes a lot of sense. But then there's like, so I get it. There's like so much there that you got to think about. Yeah.
So if someone, let's just talk about your book. Let's make sure we plug it here. So if someone is like, you know what, I don't read a whole lot of books, why should I read your book? Like, I'm not the type to pick up a book, but I'll think about it, because what you've said on the podcast is really good. What do you think someone's going to learn if they read your book? Like what do you hope someone after they read your book walks away with?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And it's a question I was asking myself, like, why am I writing this book? How am I going to write this book? I will say that when I was pitching, so there's a whole process to get published, which isn't fun. I don't recommend it. But wasn't it when I was pitching myself, everyone wanted me to write my book in like an essay format, what you see a lot of books written, like, and there's nothing, I'm not knocking on the essay format books. Yeah. I really felt in my spirit that I was supposed to write this as a memoir, not as like a nonfiction book. And there were several reasons for that. But I think the biggest reason is I wanted people to feel seen. I get messages all of the time from people who've read the book and said, you have put words to my lived experience that I couldn't articulate before. You know, thank you. I feel seen. This happened to me. I feel like you took a chapter out of my book and wrote it down, and I feel validated and I feel seen. And so that's one reason. I really think if you read the book, especially if you're a woman, I am obviously, definitely if you're a woman, I think you're going to identify with it. But another reason I wrote it as a memoir is because I wanted to talk about my failures and my shortcomings and the things I had to unlearn. Like I said, I was a mission. I worked in missions, and that context of coming from white evangelical Christianity was deeply flawed. And I got called out really hard about white supremacy and white saviorism in me. And I wrote it down, and I wrote those emails, those really extremely painful emails that this guy wrote to me. In retrospect, they were very painful. Now I just see them as like, I needed that. I needed that. I needed someone to tell me to do better. And so that's another reason I think through learning from my mistakes, you can hopefully avoid making some of the mistakes I've made. And I think I do, to toot my own horn, I think I do a really good job of connecting the issue of Christian patriarchy. So this, you know, traditional gender roles, purity culture, and connecting it to the harm that we're seeing all over the world, to women all over the world. Because like I said, I did a lot of missions work with all over the globe with women, ranging from female genital mutilation to sex trafficking. And I even talk about this one experience I had where I was working with women who had been trafficked in the Philippines. And, you know, one of the nights I was there, I was talking to a woman, it was her first night, and she didn't want to be there. She didn't want to go with these guys that wanted to buy her for the night. And so, I mean, it's a whole long story, but I ended up buying her, for lack of a better term, before these men could, these 6 drunk men. And these men got really angry because they felt entitled to her and her body, and tried to take her anyways. And I ended up arguing with the bar managers and like won the argument and was able to prove that I paid for her first. And it was like this huge like conflict. The whole bar was staring at us. And she was able to go home safe. But these men got really, really angry that they were denied something they felt they were entitled to. And in their anger, they just pulled another woman off the stage and took her. And I remember that woman looking back at us with nothing but terror in her eyes. And to give a little bit of more backstory, I know women that I have worked with who have been murdered by their clients. And so I didn't know what was going to happen to her that night. I felt like in some way I was definitely responsible because I made these men angry. They were, you know, drunk men are bad, but angry drunk men are worse. And I just felt like I had made the situation worse. And I remember like, God, what am I even doing here? Like, we can help one woman and it's so much effort and it's so much work, and it seems to be worth nothing because she's so quickly replaced. And that was the story I had seen again and again. I might be able to help this one woman, but then there's another story of violence. There's another story of sexual assault. There's another story of sexual abuse. It's just overwhelming. These stories don't stop happening. And I'm like, God, what do I even do? Because I don't feel like this is enough. I don't feel like I'm doing it right. I don't feel like this is the work I'm meant to be doing. And I remember I didn't sleep that night. I was really having a crisis of faith and calling, and what was I even doing? And the next night, I feel like God gave me an answer. Like, why does this happen? And I feel like he answered it. And I went to this bar, and these American men called us over and were asking us what we were doing there. And we told them, oh, we're partnering with this ministry that helps women get a college education, la-di-da-di-da. And we turned the question back on these men and we said, what are you doing here? Why are you here? And this man said that he came to get the respect he deserved, that women in the United States did not know their place. They were not submissive enough, but these women here who were exploited knew how to please a man, and they knew how to treat men. And he went on this really long monologue about women not knowing their place. And as he was talking, I'm like, this is so familiar. This is so familiar. This is so familiar. Where have I heard this? And it just hit me like a ton of bricks. This is what I had heard from Christian pastors my entire upbringing. And it finally connected to me. This is not representative of Christ. This is harming women. These teachings that say that men deserve respect and should get it at all costs, these teachings that I had heard from Christian pastors, they are the problem. They are driving the sex trade here. They are driving the abuse I've encountered. They're driving the abuse that I've lived through. They're driving through female genital mutilation. It's all connected to this idea that men are better than women and women are there to serve them. It's all stemming from that. And so why is the church, this place that's supposed to be a place of liberation and life, teaching these toxic teachings that have vast amounts of harm? And it was just this moment of connection. And I felt like God wanted me to quit my job and tell everyone what I learned. And so that's what I've been doing is we got to get to the root of this. This is not about lust. This is about men being entitled to women's bodies. This is about men feeling that women were created for them. This is the problem, and the church is deeply complicit, and I will call it out until the day I die. So I think that's why you should read my book.
So that's a long elevator. No, I'm just kidding. That's a great elevator pitch. No, I would say everything you said was great. I want to say I'm 4 or 5 chapters in, so I'm not, you're a great storyteller. So you tell these stories really well. And you hit the ground running. You don't ease into it. You're like right into like the hard stories, the stuff that people need to hear. So like, be prepared. Once you open this book and start reading, it's going to hit right away to serious topics. I think guys should be reading this too.
Oh, so absolutely.
I know you said like, you had mentioned women, but like, I think especially, and I think all guys, especially if you've grown up in purity culture, you should be reading it because it's going to connect, I think, even deeper to some of your lived experience or in the evangelical church in general. But even if you haven't, you've experienced the power dynamics because they're in society, even if you're not in the church. But then also I feel an obligation to even like double, triple down. If you listen to Beyond Boundaries podcast or go to the Belong Collective and you're checking this out, I want to say, if you are a father of a daughter, please read this book. I just think it opens up some understanding. And look, it shouldn't just have to be your daughter. People are people. It should be that you have a concern for women in general. But I think as a father, I have a greater concern to be mindful of women's issues in a way that if I was selfish enough to not care when I didn't have a daughter, hopefully that wouldn't be the case. But at the same time, now that I do have a daughter, I have a vested interest in the systems not being the same as she comes into adulthood is what I guess I'm trying to say. Again, I should hope that for all of humanity, but at the same time, I have a special connection with my daughter. I want her to experience a different kind of liberation in who she is. And so I think those of you who are #girldads need to be reading this book too. I just want to put that out there. Any final words or anything else you would want to say or share with the audience? Obviously, let them know where they can find out, connect with you as far as like Instagram and all that. That's how I connected with you. And I love your Instagram.
Well, thank you. It's a little fiery if you want some
it is
spice in your life.
The eight comes out. The 8 comes out on Instagram,
yes,
right? Yeah.
everyone thinks I'm an 8, which is fine. Yeah, but anyways, we can get into Enneagram later. But yeah, so I just want to thank you for having me on, and I really deeply appreciate it when men are willing to learn, because sadly that is not the case oftentimes.
I learned a ton today. Like I've got like follow-up things that I wrote down. Like, you got to listen to that and listen to that. And so like, yeah, I learned a ton today, and I'm still going to learn as I finish this book. So it's like, I think the posture of learning is where we need to be. And especially those of us who have been taught we're in power. So I totally double down on that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm really grateful for men being willing to learn, because that is not an experience that women, I don't usually have men that are like, oh, well, let me talk about your book. And so I'm appreciative of
well, time out. Cause that's part of purity culture, or at least part of church culture, is that I shouldn't learn from a woman. I'm a man. I shouldn't learn from a woman, but I'm sitting here for the last over an hour listening to Meghan tell me and teach me about this, because I don't know about this. I didn't experience things that you've experienced. And I think that people's church is us being willing to learn from each other, learn from our queer brother and sister, our minority brother or sister, or, you know, our person of color. Like, I think this is where it's like, I think an openness to learn from the lived experiences of others and the education they've picked up along the way. Like, if we don't have that, we are living in the ruler's church, because like there's that, and I shed that a while ago, and I want to learn from anybody and everybody I can who's ultimately lifting up an ethic of love, which I sense that, you know, anything that's moving toward equity is moving toward a more loving understanding of our world and how we relate to one another. So sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. I just realized when you said that, I was like, well, of course. That's part of purity culture too, is that I don't have to, it's not even that I have to devalue your experience. It's that you don't even get a seat at the table as a teacher to teach me anything. So why would I ever have to pause and learn from you, which is a whole nother thing we could have spent a whole episode talking about. It's just, I guess there's going to have to be a part 2 is what I'm saying.
Yeah. But then if you think about the power differentials, right? Like,
it's exactly
people are even blind to the power differentials. And then we know that these power differentials are exactly what's causing sexual assault. And so I think there is so much, there's all that to say. If you're a man, please read it. Please listen. I might make you angry, but I hope that you can learn through it. So pick up my book, Women Rising, listen to the podcast. There's some really great episodes I think you can learn from Faith and Feminism. And if you want to find my spicy Instagram, it's Meghan Tschanz. My name is hard to spell, but I'm sure it'll be in the show notes.
Yeah, it'll be in the show notes. Yeah. Awesome. And I'll link I'll make sure to link the podcast in the show notes too. Meghan, thank you so much for being on. This was a really great conversation. And I feel like, as great of a conversation as it was, there was so much more that we could have covered. So maybe in the future we'll talk again, because I really, really appreciate you and all your work. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you.